Well, good afternoon, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, for this chat, this discussion on a very important subject, in any case, for Austria, and therefore I'm very happy that it was included in the agenda of the Austria in Europe Days. I mean, you're aware, of course, those of you who've studied the history of this part of the world, that the motto of today's discussion is in fact taken from a famous adage referring to the history of Austria, the history of the Habsburg family, and the history of the House of Austria, where they said, "Others may wage war, but you, happy Austria, marry." When Austria became a great power, not thanks to military prowess, but to a very shrewd policy of getting married to the right partners whose families died out afterwards, and they then inherited their respective empires. And this is when Austria became, at least for a certain period, the empire where the sun never set. And there's also another motto linked to this part of our history, a sort of an epigram, an anagram developed by one of the emperors of the 5 vowels of the alphabet, A-E-I-O-U, and there are various transcriptions for this, one being in German, "Als Erdreich ist Österreich untertan," basically meaning the entire world is under the rule of the House of Austria, which, as you are well aware, was never quite the case and is certainly not the case anymore. And then, of course, there was this other motto, this other way of interpreting it, which said, "Austria erit in orbe ultima," if you translate that freely, meaning that if the world collapses, the last country standing will be Austria. And I think that takes us to today's motto. We are in a situation where others are waging war quite closely, as the title says, in a certain sense, waging war for us. And we shouldn't forget that that geographically the Ukrainian border is closer from Vienna than the Swiss border, and in fact not much further away than Alpbach. So I think that is something that you should also not forget. So people are waging war, but will Austria be the last neutral country standing in the world? And that is in a certain sense what we are trying to discuss today. And to get an answer to this question, we have a very eminent panel that has come here together. I have the pleasure of introducing Anna Maria Corazza-Bildt, who is of Italian origin, but also Swedish, first of all, by marriage, but also by political affiliation. She was a member of the European Parliament for the moderates and now is deeply involved in European politics for the Swedish liberals. And I think she will certainly give us the Swedish angle to this question, which may have some interest for Austria. There's another representative, eminent representative from a neutral country, in Sweden, of course, formerly non-aligned, now still neutral country, and that is Eamon Gilmore, former Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Ireland, EU Special Representative for Human Rights, and also leader at one point of the Irish Social Democrats, of the Irish Labour Party. So I think he will give us the Irish angle to this question. And then we have two very eminent Austrian representatives here, Mrs. Stefanie Fenkart, who is the director of the International Peace Institute located in Vienna and was one of the 2 experts nominated by the Austrian Green Party when the Austrian security strategy was negotiated, and as the Austrian government, which consists, as you know, of the Christian Democrats and the Greens, agreed on this strategy today, it's an opportune moment to have her here. And Mr. Christoph Schwarz, who is a senior research fellow of the Austrian Institute for European Security. And I think these 4 contributions will get us started, and then hopefully we will have a lively discussion. The seating arrangement in a circle is the kind of arrangement that I think psychoanalysts also advise if you want to discuss problems in a marriage or in a greater family. So we have this wonderful setup here to discuss the future of Austria as objectively as possible. So Anna Maria, could you get us started?
Thank you very much, dear friends. On 22nd of February 2022 has been a watershed for all of us Europeans, including the Austrians. Putin's aggression to a neighbor has trying to change the order of peace and security based on the rule of law. The kept peace in our continent has been subverted with imperialism back to Europe. There is no status quo. We all have to think out of the box. And the first question I would like to ask our Austrian friends is, are you going to look in the eyes of the orphans, of the young people of Ukraine that are here today, and tell them, your parents died, shed their blood, to rewrite the history of Europe? They are rewriting the history of Europe. But we didn't do enough. Because of doctrine, because of ideology, because of our past. That is the issue. So I would like to say I have full respect, being Italian, who arrived in Sweden from founding members of NATO. For me, it was normal. That is the transatlantic alliance, which is a political alliance, which is based on deterrence, is based on having weapons to avoid war and to keep peace, not having weapons to wage war. And there's been no war in NATO countries since 1949. It was very difficult to understand the Swedes, who had been neutrality for 200 years, and that was it. So I have full understanding that neutrality sits in the DNA of the Austrian people, that it's been your way of recovering independence in 1955, that it is part of your identity. But Putin has put everything upside down. So the Swedish people, 3 years ago, if you looked at the opinion polls, we're still talking about military non-alignment. The Minister of Defense of the socialist government in 2021 went out continuously to say Sweden is not going to enter NATO. And in 2024, Sweden is a full member of NATO, together with Finland, providing 0.8 of its GDP to Ukraine, providing anti-tank missiles, APCs, tanks, electronic equipment for the F-15, airborne material, and so on. Training, we're training hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers in Sweden. Why did that happen? Because we felt the threat. We felt that we are already at war. The KGB is infiltrating our minds, infiltrating our souls, infiltrating our societies, that there is an Eastern Front where the Ukrainians are waging war for us, but there's a Western Front, which is in Austria, in Italy, in Sweden, where there's a hybrid war. And what's the objective? Putin's objective is to divide, destabilize, and weaken Europe. So any fragmentation, anyone who is not fully committed behind the common and security policy, which is in the treaty that everyone subscribed, is playing in Putin's hands. Thanks God in Alpa you can dare open and free discussions. So please, break the taboos. We need a leader in Austria who makes the case, puts it on the political agenda. We need opinion builders who go out and write editorials, pros and cons, of course. Turn all the stones, why yes, why no, but please talk about it. The last thing I would like to say, I served in the United Nations. 6 years, I was the longest serving civilian in the wars in the Balkans. 3 years in Sarajevo, the siege of Sarajevo. I really risked my life with the UN. I left the United Nations, not because I don't like it, but because I understood that the European Union and NATO, I understood it just by being in the field, that the European Union and NATO are the two institutions that are able, if they develop in the right direction, if we work together and stick together, to provide peace and security and stability in Europe in the future. And when I saw the NATO troops coming and the Swedish peacekeeper working with the NATO troops, same professionalism, same training, but the Swedes were left out of the door, of course. When the intelligence was shared, they were taking the same risks, but they were not having access to the same information. So being a member of NATO for a European country is also to strengthen the pillar of Europe in NATO. That's what happened when Finland and Sweden entered. Europe is stronger in NATO, which means that Sweden is stronger, Finland is stronger. We Europeans with our values are stronger in NATO. But if anyone here can tell me if Austria would be less vulnerable by being a member of the Atlantic Alliance, if any here can give me an argument how being in a partnership, in an alliance, in a family of shared values will make you less secure than being alone and dreaming that we will come to save you when you are not helping as much as you could. You are helping, but not as much as you could. When blood is shed in our continent, please, let's put these questions in the public debate. Let's make the case for NATO membership of Austria. Let's break the taboo. Thank you.
Well, thank you for getting us started in this very lively manner. And although you addressed your questions, and justifiably so, because this is about Austria and its security policy to Austria, I think the same questions in a certain sense would also be valid if addressed to Ireland. And therefore, if I may play on what you said, Eamon, could you answer the question, first of all, if Ireland is doing everything it can do in the interest of Austrians, of Europe, not Austrian, but European security and defense? Secondly, are you playing the game of Putin by staying outside of NATO? And what is the state of discussion in your country?
Thanks very much, Thomas, and thank you for the opportunity to contribute to this. I'm not going to offer any advice at all to Austria. I think the question as to whether Austria becomes a member of NATO and how Austria sees its own defence policy and its cooperation with the rest of Europe, I think is a decision for Austrians to make. I will explain Ireland as a neutral country, and I just want to explain it a little bit, because I think each of the countries that are or have been neutral in a different way and for different reasons, and have a different understanding, I think, probably of neutrality. When the Irish policy of neutrality evolved in the early years of our independence, it was in response to our war of independence from Britain, the civil war that took place afterwards, which was largely motivated by the partition of the island, which took place before our independence. And the idea that we would find ourselves, by whatever means, in a military alliance with the United Kingdom was simply unthinkable. When NATO was formed in 1949, we were invited to join NATO, and we declined that invitation. It was a conscious political decision at the time, but I think it was also probably constitutionally necessary, because joining NATO would have meant accepting that Northern Ireland was legitimately part of the United Kingdom. And our constitution at that time had a provision in it that claimed the entire island for the state of Ireland, claimed that national territory. And actually, that remained our constitutional position until 1998, when in a referendum we gave up that claim as a consequence of the Northern Ireland Peace Agreement and the Good Friday Agreement. So in the period after the Second World War, and in particular after Ireland joined the United Nations in the mid-1950s, we evolved this kind of idea of positive neutrality. Support for the multilateral system, support for the UN Charter, involvement in peacekeeping, foreign policy, in which we very substantial development cooperation. Neutrality became really a pillar of our foreign policy. And I suppose began to come into question following our membership of the European Economic Community, as it then was, in 1972, and as the EU evolved over the decades with the development of the Common Foreign and Security Policy, Common Security and Defence Policy, the idea of Defence Union. So we required for each of the main treaty changes the holding of a referendum. The Constitution requires that. So there has always been a public debate about, well, does this evolution in EU policy now require us to abandon our policy of neutrality? And that was always resolved by reassurance to the voting public. No, this doesn't affect neutrality. We're not politically neutral. We're militarily non-aligned. And there were written into the treaties protocols and declarations and so on, which underpinned, and agreed by all the member states, which underpinned that. So Irish neutrality comes down, I think, to probably, I think, two things. One is membership of NATO, and the second is what is the extent of our involvement in European defence. We had a formal consultation on this. It was chaired by Louise Richardson, the former Vice-Chancellor of the University of Oxford, last year, and it reached the conclusion that there is no mood in the country for changing the policy of neutrality and for membership of NATO. But arising from that consultation, there have been a number of developments. One has been a decision to have a new national defence strategy, and that's being worked upon. Secondly, there is a renewed emphasis on the defence of the maritime area, because in fact our maritime area is about 10 times our land area, and it has significance in terms of broader European defence, because a lot of the US-European cables are through that maritime area. And there have been a couple of incursions in recent times, which I think has caused. Also on cyber defence, there's been a renewed emphasis on that. There has been a realisation that we are seriously underspending on defence. Our army, the size of our army, reduced considerably after the end of the conflict in Northern Ireland. So there is now an increase in spending in defence, and there is a renewed commitment to cooperation on European defence, and that has been expressed at different times through Partnership for Peace with NATO, PESCO, and some of the new individual methods that are now being used. On the issue of Ukraine, there has been absolutely strong political support for Ukraine. Ireland has not used its neutral position and the requirement for unanimity in the Council to block any of the initiatives that have been taken, and certainly doesn't intend to do that. We have not been in a position, because of the policy of neutrality, to commit to the supply of lethal equipment, but we have supplied non-lethal equipment and used through the European Peace Facility and taken our share of the cost of that. And I think also in terms of the hosting of Ukrainian refugees, we're numerically among one of the highest countries. If one takes out the countries in the immediately bordering Ukraine and Russia, we're at the top end in terms of the numbers of Ukrainian refugees, and if one looks at it on a per capita basis, we're even higher still. I agree with Anna Maria. The 22nd of February 22 was a moment I didn't think it would happen, that we would see war of this kind happening again in Europe. I don't dispute that it represents a threat to all of us, and I don't think there should be any ambiguity about that. But I think where we are at in Ireland is the policy of neutrality will not change. It would require a referendum. There is not sufficient support for it. I don't see that there will be sufficient support for it, but I think we can work within that to work in a cooperative way with our European partners in strengthening European defence and making whatever contribution we can make.
Thank you, Eamon. Could I ask you, Eamon, before going to the next speaker, amongst the things you do in support of Ukraine, I sort of remember that you also were involved in training initiatives, or?
Yes, we have been involved in training. Our army has been involved in training, and also in the supply of like demining activity, and so on. We've supplied demining equipment and have been involved in.
Because that's a very valid point, because we had the discussion on that subject in Austria as well, and if I remember correctly, we went less far than Ireland in this point, so I think that is just worth being noted. Now, we will move to our Austrian speakers, and as I said earlier on, today is the day when the Austrian security strategy got voted in government. It still has to go to parliament, but as I said, it's a process in which both Mrs. Fenkard and I were involved as experts, and the strategy, which is now being published, says a number of interesting things, amongst other things that war has come back to Europe, and I think we've understood that everybody is affected by his geography. Sweden, obviously, in a very direct way, Ireland in a very direct way, and Austria in another way. And obviously, we lived in the days when we said that fighting with tanks in the Machfeld, which is the only flat part of Austria, is more or less excluded and will never happen again. And now we see combat of tanks a few hundred kilometers away from the Austrian borders, and we are obviously much closer to the scene of the fighting than Ireland is. So I think it would be interesting to hear from you as well, and also the contributions you see that Austria can make in this context.
Thank you very much. Thanks for everybody to join us, and I also hope then afterwards that we have also an interesting discussion with all of you, because I think it's a very interesting topic which normally is only discussed between the neutral states, and I think it doesn't really have a lot of, let's say, it's not really a hot topic for other non-neutral states in general when we have the discussion when it comes to security, when it comes to other issues. Nobody really cares too much, because Austria and Ireland, we are still very small countries. That's just in the beginning. Austria became neutral in 1955. We became neutral in the sense of, because we thought that this is our way out of not being parted like Germany was. So it was an idea to actually keep our sovereignty, and since 55, I mean, it's also then our national day, the 26th of October, when we declared more or less our everlasting neutrality, how it is called. We decided that this is important for Austria in the sense of keeping our sovereignty, but it became very important also for the people. So we really put it in the DNA of the Austrians. I think it's really incredible if you have like all the opinion polls that more than between 70 and 80% of the Austrian population still is very, very much in favor. I just think we need to acknowledge that, and maybe we also need to challenge that maybe. Austrians' neutrality changed over time, very obviously, because we became European Union members. So this is the big, I would say, difference when it comes to Switzerland. So we became member of the European Union. We're actually also part of the common foreign and security policy. So we kind of always find our, let's say, workaround so that we could say, okay, we still keep neutral even though we are joining the common foreign and security policy. We saw the value in neutrality for some time, especially in the Cold War, because we were bordering, obviously, the Warsaw Pact, and we had like this idea of Austria as being this bridge builder between East and West. Obviously, it changed when the Iron Curtain fell, and then as well with the European Union. So what is the discussion right now? I think you're very, very right. We are not really having this discussion on a political level, because for the political parties, it's a very hot topic, especially because of the things I just said earlier, that 80% of the population are still very much in favor. We don't have an honest discussion about what Austrian military neutrality actually means. We are solely militarily neutral, meaning that we cannot join a military alliance like NATO is the case, and that we cannot have foreign troops on our soil. So this is actually what the neutrality law says. So in Austria, it's actually a law which has a constitutional value. I think this is also a difference when it came to Sweden, because Sweden was more or less non-aligned and not in the sense of neutrality as we put it. Also in international law, we also have like this document where we gave it to the United Nations. We have, I would say, a very romantic and moral, I would say, idea about neutrality, as if it is something good. And I think this is something we need to challenge. So we don't really, it's not better to be neutral. We are not politically neutral. We had a very clear stance also when it came to the war of aggression against Ukraine. And I just think I always need to mention it didn't start in 2022. It did start in 2014, but we just really didn't really look at it. And I think it's just very important for us that none of us, the European countries, we didn't really look what is going on there. So, I mean, I know in Sweden at that time already, at least the Swedish government, you already thought a little bit about changing the non-alignment thing since 2014. In Austria, this did not happen at all. We tell the Austrian population more or less that neutrality is something which protects us, and I think this is not true. I think neutrality is not something which protects us, but neutrality can have an additional value. And I just would like to speak about these elements because I think the discussion Austria needs to have first is not neutrality or NATO. I really think we need to think about how we actually want to live neutrality in changing times when wars are back on our ground, when we have like different other crises, when we have like so many security risks. So we need to think, what is the value of neutrality nowadays? Can we still have this bridge building function? I mean, I think it's a very serious question because this is what we are repeating all the time. We are coming back to Bruno Kreisky, what he did in the Middle East. Bruno Kreisky, what he did there. Bruno Kreisky, I mean, I think he has a very, very good legacy, but nevertheless, he died a long time ago, more than 30 years ago. And later, we really didn't, we still kind of live off this past, I would say, successes, what we had when we had some, I would say, diplomatic stances in the international arena, which was good, but I think it's gone. And I think either we need to discuss, can we still revive it? I think with Russia, no. We have to be very, very honest. If we are not perceived as neutral, and we are not perceived as neutral by Russia, they say it quite clearly. By the way, we were also not perceived by Ukraine as neutral before 2022. So if you're not perceived as neutral, you cannot act neutral. So that is very important. So still, nevertheless, when I speak, because I come from the peace field, when I speak with organizations dealing with peace building, conflict mediation, especially in the Middle East, it was different. We still there, it made a difference that we are a neutral country. It was just easier to cooperate. It has a lot to do with anti-Americanism and all those things. I mean, coming from, I don't know, the Iraq wars, you name it. So in these cases, it worked a little bit better. I mean, okay, what else can Austria do? We know we have all the international organizations here. So it's a place to meet. It's a place to meet. We had the Iran nuclear deal was actually not only here, it was also in Geneva, but it was more or less, I would say, negotiated in Austria as well and in Geneva. So we did some things in the sense of actually contributing to security. And maybe it's just a final point, which I think is very important, because I think security is not defense. You mentioned the security strategy. If you look at the new security strategy, we actually see it. I didn't manage to read the whole thing yet today. You will see that more than 90% of the security threats we are facing are non-military. So we have climate change, we have like all these other issues, we have information warfare, we have cyber, we have energy, we have so many different things, migration, democracy, the state of rule of law. So all those things are actually not really directly connected to, I would say, the defense sector. I just think it's very important also to say that defense is not the same as security. Defense is a part of security, I think, and it's an important part, and it became a lot more important in recent years, especially, obviously, since the Russian attack on Ukraine. Maybe just one more thing, what the Austrian position was when the war against Ukraine happened. The Chancellor said Austria is neutral, stays neutral, and will stay neutral. And so he killed every debate. I think that was not really the best thing to do, because I think we need to have a debate. We need to think about what neutrality means, what can it be, and if we then come to the conclusion, it's overrated, we don't need it any longer, we then can discuss NATO, non-alignment, whatever. I mean, these are still the options, they are still there. But I do very much agree that we need to discuss what neutrality means today and what the added value is. And maybe just to say maybe one more thing, there is one, I would say, element which in my opinion is very important, and it is absolutely neglected these days. It is nuclear disarmament, and it is disarmament in general, and arms control, etc. Austria has been in history very, very engaged in these. We have very, very good diplomats, Alexander Kment, for example, or yourself. I mean, we had very, very good diplomats working for these issues, and I still think it is very important that we discuss, even in times when we also need to see that we have to build up our armed forces, which is important for Austria especially, because it's actually an armed neutrality, what we should be having. But on the other hand, also that Austria has been doing a lot when it comes to nuclear disarmament, anti-mine, landmines, Ottawa Declaration, and all those issues. I just think these are some maybe positive elements of the Austrian neutrality. Problem is really we need to discuss, is it still relevant? What can we else do? And is it really useful? And as I said, I don't think it protects us. It didn't happen in Belgium in the First and Second World War. They were neutral. And I think this is something the Austrian society needs to understand. The front is very, very close, and we cannot just close our eyes and believe that it's far away. And I think this is really part of the problem we are facing. And I'm very happy to speak more about any issues or questions later.
Well, thank you very much. I've probably been more involved personally in Austrian armament than in Austrian disarmament, but thank you for that comment as well. I would say that thank you also for giving the historical context, because I mean you were very clear in saying that Austria, declared neutrality. I mean, to be a little even more blunt than you were, to get rid of the Russian army. I mean, that was the historical price we paid for it, and it then became a national mantra. And as you rightly also say, not only is it deeply rooted in Austrian society, there's also a feeling that we are better people because we are neutral. And that, I think, is something that needs to be discussed as well. And just one point I'd also make is you referred to what the Chancellor said about Austria having been neutral, remaining neutral, and being neutral in the future. I mean, our neutrality, as I think Christoph Schwarz will explain, evolved quite considerably over the years. But the Chancellor said this when he came from the Versailles summit, informal summit, where this declaration was signed up by all heads of state and government of the European Union, including him, and where he also pointed to the fact that there's a reference there in this declaration which says that the mutual assistance clause within the European Treaty, Article 42.7 of the European Union Treaty, is an expression of solidarity of all member states with each other. So at the same time, he said we are part of a system where there's mutual solidarity when it comes to defense and security. And I think that's something we shall also look into. And I think that Mr. Schwarz is very well placed to discuss about this background. Please.
Thank you, Thomas. Dear participants, I'm very happy to speak here today. And solidarity is already the word that I want to focus on most crucially, because I want to talk about an issue I see in the relationship between Austria's neutrality and European solidarity. I want to start with the good news for Austria and the European Union, which is that since Austria joined the European Union in 1995 and throughout all the treaty changes that followed, Austria has established the necessary legal basis to fully participate in the common foreign and security policy and the common security and defense policy of the European Union. While this certainly did require some creative flexibility at times, Austria took those steps, and with the introduction of Article 23J into the Austrian Constitution, Austria provided the legal basis to fully participate, for example, in mutual defense under Article 42.7, in the Petersberg tasks, in sanctions, and all other initiatives of the EU, such as permanent structured cooperation and others. So one could say that Austrian neutrality and European foreign and security policy have been perfectly aligned. Most legal obstacles have been moved out of the way, allowing Austria to act in solidarity with its fellow EU member states. However, there is a major catch, and this is the Austrian population and the fortunate fact that Austria is a democracy. The problem being that the public has been kept largely in the dark about the political and legal evolution that Austrian neutrality was exposed to. Over the years, Austrian neutrality has been largely depoliticized, possibly as a consequence to the changes in the international system and Austria's role within that system. Meanwhile, Austria has become increasingly integrated into the EU's foreign security and defense policy. This has led to a situation where Austria prescribed itself to European solidarity, yet a large part of society still clings to a notion of neutrality, which is rooted in the previous century, in a time when Austria was a buffer state between the competing blocs of the Cold War. This discrepancy significantly limits Austria's political maneuverability. The war in Ukraine being a prime example of this, whether we're talking about the training of Ukrainian troops, arms shipments in the context of the EU, or demining. Initiatives such as those very quickly create an image in the Austrian society that they are a breach of neutrality, although these initiatives would actually be possible based on Austria's constitution. The most critical challenge that we would face would be in the scenario of a high-intensity mutual defense case in the European Union, for which Austrian society would be entirely unprepared for. As data from the University of Innsbruck shows, Austrians have, or to a large degree, have a very lopsided view on European solidarity. While 70% would expect other EU member states to come to Austria's assistance in case of a military conflict, only 14% would reciprocate in such circumstances. So, in summary, I want to say that neutrality has become a significant marker for Austrian identity and for Austrian state building after the Second World War. However, and this is the major problem we face, they have not been included in the process where Austria's neutrality has lost significant relevance in the framework of EU integration. So I believe that Austria must confront an issue which may turn into an uncomfortable debate, which is, do we really see our place within a united Europe? And if the answer to that question is yes, then I believe we have, as a society, to start committing to European solidarity. At present, I believe we're still far from that point.
I will open up, and I've seen that you've asked for the floor. I will open up this discussion in 1 minute. I think we're very grateful, at least I am, to Mr. Schwarz, to have underlined the legal situation in which we are in. Because in fact, we've changed the constitution substantially already in 1995. And I mean, to cut it short, the constitution basically says that where there are obligations under European solidarity, they override other constitutional obligations, including those of neutrality. But you also say that we never really told the Austrian public. And the Austrian public remains very committed in the emotional manner that you have described to neutrality as it is. And there is the question that Mrs. Fenkert asked, what can we really do, what can we really still do on this basis? I mean, in the past, people have described the attitude that Austria has had to its neutrality to what you call a salami tactic, and the salami getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And in reality, we are confronted with the tip of the salami, which is what we call remaining Restneutralität, the rest of neutrality. And I think we really have to define where we go from here. And I think that it was also clear from the statements of Anna Maria and Eamon that the decision, at least partly, is based on geography. Sweden has its own geography, Ireland has its own geography, and we have to look at this matter from the viewpoint of Austrian geography. So with this, I open the discussion, and I'll take 3 or 4 questions and please, if you could introduce yourself when taking the floor.
Yes, my name is Thomas Seifert. I'm a journalist with European Voices, an English-speaking quarterly. And just for the sake of the argument, and also as I'm a dialectic person, I would ask the cui bono question and also the cost-benefit analysis to you guys. And that is, okay, what is the added value of Austria joining NATO? I've been an army officer, we've been brave people, but the added value is not like United States what they bring to the table, or nuclear power like Britain or so on. And what is the cost of giving up neutrality in probably losing the headquarters of the OSCE, losing possibly the headquarters of the UN, and also losing the status of what you said about Vienna being this place of meeting. That should also be part of the consideration, because I don't think that will be possible if we are formally not neutral to keep this institution in Vienna, which as a journalist for me that would be quite sad actually, less to report on. And that is what I want to bring to this discussion, to turn things around and say, yes, everybody, we all I think agree that the neutrality is outdated as it is, but also what are the benefits? And what you said, and I agree with you, maybe it's a lack of creativity, it's a lack of initiative that we're not in Kreisky's times, because we had, I'm sorry that Thomas, I don't want to be aggressive here, but for a long time, and I've seen as a journalist, the foreign ministry was more or less like the WKO, like the trade commission. That was the major thing that a lot of what the work was of our embassies. Sorry, this I want to provoke, but it's true to a certain degree. So yes, if we are staying neutral, and this is very legitimate, I'm not against it. I've been to Ukraine many times. I'm going to be there on 17th of September. I know what you're all talking about by having grenades being lobbed at me in Bakhmut, in Volodar, in Seversky, Kupiansk, in all these places. Russia is an enemy, full stop. But the question is, couldn't we help more if we just double or triple our aid to Ukraine, if we just take in double and triple the numbers of kids and women and whoever wants to come, if we build field hospitals. There's a lot of things we still could do would be under the banner of neutrality, which would fit the bill, and I don't think that we do what everybody else does. Look at this as, let's say, a marketing pitch. If we are just one more member of NATO, great, fine, yes. But if we are neutral, and there I agree, I think, with all that's been said, yes, but then it means we have to be more creative, we have to be more initiative, we have to double the budget of the foreign ministry, and the foreign ministry should do mainly what a foreign ministry does. That's development aid, that's peace work, this is that political work, and not so much thinking about where the next gas pipeline will come from. This is what I'm talking about. And I think this discussion we should have, and I'm happy that we have it. Thank you so much for giving us all this podium for a long overdue discussion.
Thank you. Thank you for making these interesting and thought-provoking points. I will just say that if I remember the statistics, that in the past some NATO countries were amongst the greatest providers of development aid as well on a per capita basis. So I think that's something that one should also not forget. Mr. Fehlinger, you wanted to come in.
Yes, my name is Günther Fehlinger-Jahn. I run the NATO campaign in Austria since about 2.5 years. I've started a public petition with about 6,800 signatures to call for NATO membership. So there are at least 6,800 people in Austria who are ready to sign officially for NATO membership. And the truth of the matter is Austria alone cannot join NATO, because the sad truth of Austria is that our political parties and our institutions are deeply compromised by Russia. We don't want to hear that, everybody will protest, but the truth of the matter is that the 17 years of neutrality have led to a very deep compromised situation in our security service, in our military, and the political parties as well. And therefore there will be no internal change of this. The proof of that is actually in the last 2 years there was not a single person advocating pro-NATO in the public arena with significance. Not a single parliamentarian has dared to say that word, that NATO is good, and you see it's basically a lost cause in Austria. And what I wanted to ask now is if the patience of our European partner is not running a bit thin, because we are in this decisive war. Ukrainians are dying. It is an extremely costly war with 2 trillion of cost for the European taxpayers and consumers already. And the question is, why do other countries, when we are in the European Union, where we decide every day together about policies, why is this taboo not to discuss about Austrian security arrangements from Slovakia, from Sweden, from other countries, from Germany, via my Twitter account? I try all the time to say, Mr. Kiesewetter or Strack-Zimmermann, discuss about Austria. We are one union. It's absolutely legitimate to discuss about politics. And then everybody says, no, but that's a sovereign nation, we shouldn't intervene in Austria, and I cannot understand this argument. Are we together in the European Union? Are we in one security system? And why don't we have a big debate about the immorality of Austrian neutrality and the deeply compromised status of Austria towards Russia? Why don't we have that at the European level? Because this is the only way to confront Austrian neutrality European-wide. Thanks a lot.
I think there was I saw a question back there. If there's no question back there, then I think the lady in the first row here was asking for the floor. And if you could introduce yourself.
Hello, Denise Warnick is my name. For me, I think that in Austria we're a victim of the lack of a discussion of neutrality, because we, on the one hand side, would really need this discussion, and as many of you have pointed out, we also have lots of tools like geistige Landesverteidigung, so intellectual national defense. It's also enshrined in our Bundesverfassung. And what do we need to do? And this is the question from the inside perspective to the Austrian, but also from the outside perspective from our foreign guests, to break the ice and have this discussion and finally move forward as a society.
Thank you very much. I'll take one more question there, the lady in the middle, and then I think we'll let panelists give a first answer.
Okay, thank you. And the lady in the middle happens to, I am Hena Rabanikar. This is my first time in Albach. Thank you. Thanks to Anna, Maria, and Carl. And really, what a pleasant experience. I've never been to a place this big, feeling so small. So let me just say that at the very outset. And as someone who represents a region which has been ridden by conflict, both inherited, that left by the British colonial sort of, hurried exit, all exits are eventually hurried, it seems. And the pile of problems that we kept on adding to the basket of inherited problems between India and Pakistan, and allowed the whole region to be seeped in the depths of poverty, lack of living to our true potential, et cetera, et cetera. And coming from a region where, also a country where we felt rather threatened all the time by a neighbor which was very large, very belligerent, very antagonistic, very, very animosity-ridden towards a small country which didn't have, and therefore looked for alliances far away with the US, etc. So we get it when, a lot of Europe feels very threatened when war has come to Europe after a whole, series of decades. But as a diplomat, I can call myself a diplomat now, having been foreign minister from 2010 to 13, and then minister of state just recently, and have lived and grown and fed by the world of diplomacy. I believe that when history is written, we are judged not by our reaction in the instant, by what the results and the repercussions of that reaction has been in formulating or raising the ground for peace to eventually flourish. And I ask ourselves mutually the question, how much blood shall we shed in the quest for peace, and how much is enough in terms of doing when we say, okay, no more and now? And eventually, if all conflict has to be ended at the negotiating table, which is at least what history tells us, then do we not feel value in allowing some countries to remain somewhat neutral, somewhat having the ability to be able to speak to both sides? Because in the rush to react to absolutely belligerent, I'm never going to justify anything that Russia has done. We feel what you feel because we experience it in our own region. But again, I think my question is that on the eastern side, I've explained the belligerent neighbor, and on the western side, we've had two wars which were imposed in many ways as an answer in Afghanistan, which went terribly wrong and created more extremism and conflict than were reversing. And eventually, who's running Afghanistan? After 2 decades of putting in money and everything, it's the Taliban that we went to fight in the first place, right? So just this, that when history is written, I think 2 things are going to be. One, I'm very afraid, and that is what was raised by one of the speakers also, that the real questions of showing leadership today, who's dealing with the question of climate change? Who's dealing with the question of how AI is managed? We're all making our different fences around which all of these things, the solutions are going to be. And we need leadership there, and for that we need the world to stop being divided, and decoupling may be so eventually you'll need to sit on the negotiating table. Who is going to be the people or the countries or the institutions left with the ability to do that is something that I worry about.
Well, thank you very much, Minister. I think this is a very interesting question. Obviously, it is not my role here to provide any answers, but to direct the overall discussion. But I would be interested also in a response by our panelists to the question, what is the space of a member state of the European Union to mediate in a situation where the European Union as a whole is a party? Because, I mean, when it comes to Russia and Ukraine, the European Union is a party to the conflict, to be honest. And is there a remaining space for a member state to do something useful in the way you've illustrated it? I think that is an interesting question. So I would be interested in that, an answer to that question. I would also be interested in a comment to the suggestion made by Mr. Seifert that for Austria to change its status would have immediate implications on Austria as a seat of international organizations. I don't know whether that is an opinion that is shared amongst panelists. So please, Anna Maria, you want to come in first?
Listen, it was really interesting to listen to everyone. The seat of the United Nations is in the United States. Norway has been one of the countries who has been most, with high credibility, negotiating and bringing forward peace agreements, and it's a member of NATO, a very prominent member of NATO. I do not see why Vienna should have any other role if the people of Austria would decide to enter NATO. I don't see why the OSCE cannot continue to be there. It's nothing to do with neutrality. But you can say that some NGOs in the Middle East like you more, but I can say a lot of Europeans like you less. Because we are together, our strength is unity, solidarity, cohesion, and integration. Everyone who doesn't live up to this will be seen by the next generation. I don't want to use words that belong to the past. This is a moment of truth. This is a moment of history. Austria is on the wrong side of history at the moment. Do you want to talk about that? You gave yourself the answer of your own question. You said, of course, Putin is the enemy. Basta. What else do you want to say? Do you think that you can be fish and meat at the same time in the time we live? Do you think that the European nation, with the history we have, doesn't have the moral imperative to take sides 100%? You cannot be neutral but help a little, because people are dying right now for your freedom, not only for their freedom. And their children will come to Austria and say, okay, you give us a couple of millions, but you remain neutral for what? For my father, my mother to die? This is the questions.
Who's more detrimental to Ukraine's security, NATO member Hungary or Austria?
Hungary is a problem. Hungary is a problem. We have enough problems. We have Trojan horses in Europe. We have Trojan horses in NATO. Absolutely. That doesn't justify that there is not a debate our Austrian friends have been calling for, have been saying that there is a state of denial. What I'm saying is, talk about it. And of course, it is an Irish decision. Of course, it's an Austrian decision. But it affects my children as well. Because the unity of Europe affects not only the Austrians. And the idea that one member state of the European Union could be the negotiator between Putin and Zelensky is complete bullshit. No, but that was the question that Thomas put. Austria could have a role at the negotiating table. Our friend, thank you for what you said, by the way, from Pakistan, suggested that if you remain neutral, you could maybe have a role. I mean, after Suez, the Brits, the French understood much too late that they couldn't have a role anymore as individual countries. The only one that can have a role eventually, and unfortunately we don't have it enough, is a united European Union. And if we don't focus on a united European Union, we are turning our back to the people of Ukraine. Who is going to stop Putin? He's not going to stop himself unless we stop him. And what is at stake now is, shall Ukraine become a concentration camp? Shall we have in Ukraine what we have seen in every single area that has been occupied by Russia? Because we know what happens when they occupy. And then we let Putin move to Moldavia, to Georgia, God knows where? Or are we doing everything as European to stop Putin? For me, these are the two questions. Everything else, honestly, is irrelevant in the situation that we have right now in Europe. And I really respect everything, the Austrian, Irish, and so on. But it's not only an Austrian debate, because Putin is a threat to all of us. Thank you.
Eamon.
I agree with Anna Maria on this amount, that this is a moment of truth, that Putin does have to be stopped, and that the European Union requires unity to do that. But unity is not uniformity. As I read it, my country is not going to join NATO. I don't know what the situation is in Austria. That's for another day. I don't think there are issues of moral superiority one way or the other on this. I think we need to respect that this is the situation. I think the cui bono argument, I think, does need to be looked at. It has never been the case that it is a requirement of membership of the European Union to be also a member of NATO. And I think we need to think about this, about whether it is necessarily the best thing that every EU member state should also be a member of NATO. I agree also that I think the space for individual states to act as brokers or as whatever is very limited. It's better, I think the European Union itself is better in that situation. But we also need to raise the question about whether the European Union is in a better position not being the, totally identified with NATO. There's already a perception of the European Union in places like South Asia, in Africa, that it is tied at the hip with NATO. I think the European Union, and I have had some experience of this, and talking with countries outside of Europe on human rights issues and so on over the last 5 years. I think we're in a stronger position where, yes, we're united, but we're not necessarily the downtown office of NATO, and where you have this diversity of approach, provided we maintain our unity. And I think that our discussion would be better to accept some realities, including realities about some member states not joining NATO, and look at what are the practical issues that have to be addressed in terms of security, in terms of defence, also in terms of investing in aspects of peace building which are not about military hardware, prevention, but post-conflict situation, reconciliation, all of the issues that will have to be addressed. So I would say, yes, EU unity, yes, but it's not the same as uniform. And by the way, there's one other issue on if we do conflate EU membership with NATO membership, are we then saying that countries that are in NATO but who are not in the European Union have some kind of a faster track to membership of the European Union? We need to think that through about having this absolute identity between EU and NATO.
Thank you. Before giving to Mrs. Venkert, I will say there was a moment when the Austrian discussion was summarized. It is now, I think, 20 years ago, when we basically said, within the European Union, we pursue a policy of solidarity, and outside of the European Union, there's still space for neutrality. That was, in a certain sense, the argument of that day. I don't know, Mrs. Venkert, if you want to revert to that idea, but please come in.
Yeah, maybe just a couple of things I think are very important for us actually to tackle. When we talk about the situation in Europe, first of all, the world is bigger than Europe. I think we do not really understand this, so thank you very much for what you actually brought up. I think we really are neglecting what is happening all around, and it is affecting us. It's not only climate change, it's obviously also the wars and conflicts. We are now having brutal war in Sudan. We didn't bring that up. We have brutal war in Ethiopia. If you talk about, for Europe, and I absolutely agree, the situation in Ukraine, the war against Ukraine, surely is the biggest issue for Europe. If we zoom out for the rest of the world, it's the situation in Gaza, I must say. And it is something which is very difficult for Europe and the European Union actually to come to a common ground. And the next thing is we also don't have it on Ukraine. I'm very, very sorry to say we are not as united as we seem to be when it comes to the situation in Ukraine. I mean, you do have the Eastern, you have like different fears. The West, I mean, why is NATO actually not going in? I mean, NATO is actually not officially part of the conflict. We know that. NATO actually said before 22nd of February, we are not going to put boots on the ground. So it's not really NATO, it's the Americans and its individual countries actually giving weapons, providing weapons. It's not NATO. NATO is not in there, and NATO is not there for specific reasons. Some of them might be the same which are in the Western European countries, which is mostly Spain or Portugal. They actually fear in this conflict, they fear an atomic nuclear escalation. The Baltics and Poland, they fear occupation. The others, and then you have, like it was mentioned, you said it, Hungary and whatever, they have a very, very different point of view. There is no, I mean, this is actually what we need to say first before we say Austria needs to join NATO or whatever, we need actually to say, what do we want there? What is actually the goal? Some countries actually say Russia cannot exist any longer without actually thinking what that would mean, for example, for Eurasia and those countries, because it's not as easy as it might seem. We really need to ask the tough questions and then come up with ways on actually how to approach them. Maybe something to you, because I think this is very important. I don't think we have to be NATO. I mean, I think we can discuss it, but I don't think it has to be. But you mentioned the official development assistance. I looked it up before. Ireland is a neutral country, and you are actually spending 0.67% of the GDP for official development assistance. Austria, 0.38%. So we do not even have our share there. I mean, we really can invest. I mean, this is also very important for security. The war against Ukraine, it's brutal. The Ukrainians I've been traveling a lot there, I have many friends there, it's brutal. People are dying, people are suffering, the trauma, etc. It's horrific, and it will also stay there afterwards with all the mines, etc. Austria could already say once, and at one point, I hope, there will be something like a ceasefire agreement. I come from the peace-building sector. How do wars end? They end by defeat. It's around a fifth of the wars ongoing. Then 60% end with negotiations, and 40% they do not end at all. So you always have, I mean, they might become less intense, they might become, I don't know, like locally different and stuff like this. So I really think Austria can do a lot more when it comes to European security, which is not only in the defense realm, but is essentially climate change, it's migration, it's humanitarian aid, it's literally also investing more in diplomacy. This is actually what I mentioned when I was speaking about disarmament, but also diplomacy is very important. Austria does not invest enough money for the foreign ministry. I think everyone knows that. I mean, we do have nearly no ambassadors in African countries, and one ambassador is actually occupied with 12 or 20 countries, and that's actually true. So we can invest there. We can invest actually in conflict management and research on that. Something like Swiss Peace, we don't have it, or Matti Ahtisaari Foundation in Finland. So they do these things. Also does not do all the things. I think this is what we can do, and what we should do. We are not doing it right now, in my opinion. And on the other note, maybe what also Christoph said, we could even do more when it comes to military things. We just don't do it. I mean, we could do a lot more. It's what we cannot do, and when it comes to our law, we cannot join NATO, we cannot have other troops on our ground, and we cannot directly participate in the war. Everything else we could actually do. We just would need to do. Maybe just one more thing. We are having elections in a couple of weeks. And we have one particular party which recently, not always by the way, because they shifted, have this neutrality, I don't know, logo very much on their foreyard these days. And this is something what they are doing, and it works for them. So it's also a domestic political issue. We need to be very honest. It's in a democracy, and it's not going to get away. But the discussion could be done, it should have been done, and I think this is lacking. But again, NATO and European Union are still different things, and NATO is not putting boots on the ground in Ukraine, and there is no such unity in Europe as we would like to see it.
Thank you very much. That specific party. And thank you for reminding us, which now has neutrality on its forehead, is probably the only Austrian party that at one point was explicitly in favor of NATO membership, but that's another issue. I think, Ms. Schwarz, you wanted to come in, and then I'll open a second round.
Yes, thank you. I want to pick up where Iman, Anna Maria, and Stephanie were talking about the question of being in solidarity with other European member states and helping Ukraine and being a member of NATO. I think those two things don't necessarily have to overlap. As I already said before, we do have the means, also the legal means, to do a lot of things in Europe in terms of security and defense. And I think Sweden is a good example, because I think nobody would argue that Sweden, before it joined NATO, did not support Ukraine. I mean, they already sent weapons. They were a strong partner for Ukraine without being a member of NATO. I think NATO, it's something that we should, of course, think about, but the reality is that 70% of the people in Austria are deadlocked on we need to stay neutral. So the situation for Austria is not going to change in the next 3, 4, 5 years. So I think we need to start thinking now, how can we contribute more to European security and defense with the legal framework that we have, which allows us to do a lot. We can participate, whenever there is an EU Council decision, Austria can do it, based on Article 23J of the Austrian Constitution. So let's talk to everyone in Austria about this issue, because I think not many citizens, maybe not even many or all politicians are aware of this fact, that we can do a lot in European security and defense, but we're not. So I think it's not a matter of joining NATO or not, it's a matter of living up to the commitments that we made when we joined the European Union.
Thank you very much. I would, if you don't mind, first of all, on having the possibility to legally doing what we want. This includes, by the way, providing mutual assistance on the basis of Article 42.7 of the European Union Treaty. Anna-Maria, you wanted to come in briefly?
Very small, because I completely agree with you. I don't think there is any misunderstanding. I didn't suggest that the EU and NATO should be the same. Of course, NATO shouldn't have boots on the ground. We're not going to have war with Russia. The whole idea of NATO is not to be at war, to prevent war. NATO is protecting its members that have the border with Russia. That's why Russia has invaded Ukraine, but is not yet daring to invade the Baltic states, for instance. We don't know, but that's a protection because of the deterrence. And what I said is really the debate, discuss it. It's exactly what you're saying. 70% of people is against, of course, because if you don't talk about it, if it's taboo, if no one made the case for its pros and cons, precisely, I really think there should be lots of analysis from super experts, from the defense community, from the security community, mapping down in an objective way the benefits. Of course, there has to be a very strong ground for the discussion. That is not only opinions, it's data. I totally agree with you. But my point is, it's a time to do everything you can. You don't want to enter into a fight, give more. Money is extremely important. Give weapons, give whatever you decide to do. My point was, you cannot have it all. It's a time to do everything you can, because whatever everything else, you can talk about the other conflicts, everything. Now we're talking about the security of Europe, and it's difficult, I think, for anyone to object that Putin is our biggest threat. The other security threats are less, including terrorism and everything else. Yes, but climate change is different. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I wish there were more people in the streets with, stop Putin aggression, and not only on climate change, young people with the same commitment, with the same engagement. So it's not one or the other.
Thank you. I think I would nonetheless like to open a second round now and then have the panelists coming in. I know that Mr. Zinkanel asked for the floor some time ago, Mr. Meyer at the back, and then I'll take some others. Please, Mr. Zinkanel.
Thanks so much. Thanks to the four speakers for your excellent remarks. I'd like to also touch upon an issue, Anna-Maria and Christoph, that you just mentioned now, especially this notion that the Austrian neutrality and the debate about it has always been quite emotionalized. Yeah? And especially also, Stephanie, what you said, that one particular party in the parliament is leveraging this emotionalized debate for internal political reasons, yeah, and instrumentalizing on the notion of neutrality, but also on this emotional debate about it. So my question would be, during a moment of truth, we also need facts. What are the facts about neutrality? How to communicate these facts better to the Austrian population if 17% are for neutrality, but know nothing or little about the facts? Then those 70% are significant, clearly, obviously, and it's a very emotionalized debate. I understand, and I also acknowledge the identification with neutrality, but shouldn't we also engage with those 70% and basically make them aware of the facts of neutrality? So my question is how to do that, and if there are lessons that we can draw from the Irish example, if there is a more open Irish debate in the political environment. Thank you.
I would add in the final round, it would also be interesting to learn from the Swedish debate, because I don't think we had 200 years of Swedish debate on joining NATO. It came very fast. So it would be interesting to hear how that happened as well. Thomas Meyer, please.
Thomas Meyer, I'm a journalist in Brussels, a correspondent. I personally would very much sympathize with what Mrs. Bildt has said, even that was very tough, especially for Austrians like me. But I think you're right. And I would like to bring another aspect in that debate on a more higher level, if you want. So I think the question is not if Austria or Ireland or others become member of NATO. I think the real question is, will the EU as a union become member of NATO? What do I mean by that? And I'm talking about, let's say, the next 5, 10, 20 years. What do I mean with that? I think we should be aware of history, what happened in history. And Austrians tend to ignore what happened. They try to rethink that it was the Americans in the past who saved us from the Nazis. It was the Americans who ended the war in our neighborhood on the Balkans, not so long ago. And I think now, today, we are in a situation, we have a threat by Russia and Putin, but we have to accept that in America, taxpayers are no longer prepared to pay for European security, and that's the point. So I think the question is not if Mr. Trump or Mrs. Harris will win the elections. One seems to me for sure, and I don't know anybody seriously in Brussels who ignores that. The Americans, and that has already been announced by Barack Obama 10, 15 years ago, their interests in the future are in Pacific and not in the Atlantic. So whatever we discuss here in Europe, we have to be prepared to build our own defense. So last Monday I made an interview with Joschka Fischer and I asked him that question. And he told me a very funny sentence, what he said he had heard here in Alpbach. There are only 4 countries in the European Union who are not member of NATO. You know, I'm talking about Cyprus, Malta, Ireland, and Austria. And he said 3 islands and an island of the blessed. Might be that this solution can go on for a longer period for Austria, but I think it will not be the future of security and defense in Europe. So I come to an end to my question to you. And I would also involve a slight critical remark to Sweden and to you, Mrs. Bildt. We had this long and difficult process, even until today, to unify and to strengthen the European Union as a whole when we made the common currency. I remember very well in the 90s, there were not so many people who said this will happen and this will function, and it functioned very well. The euro today is the second important currency in the world. And I think I don't have to tell you what happened in the last 10, 15 years. And we have seen the proof it works. So my question to you would be, do you think that in a dimension of 10 years or 20 years, Europeans will be responsible to create their own defense? And I don't know anybody who doesn't say this will be as a strong second pillar inside NATO and with the Americans and not against the Americans. And the question is, what then with Austria? Who would be interested in those 4 islands, only one of the blessed, with not even 20 million people of 500 in Europe, and perhaps even more in the future?
Thank you.
Thank you.
As I said, I can take 2, I think, more questions because we have to round up. I think, did you have a question?
Thank you very much. So I'm Rene. Yeah, I'm René. I'm from South Tyrol, Italy. So, and then I'm a current student at Sciences Po Paris. So maybe I got influenced by the French debate, and I have as quite a similar remark to the one you just made. I hear on this panel a lot on discussion if Austria should give up neutrality, join NATO, but shouldn't the question be more like a European solution to a European problem and not trying to rely again on the Americans too much? Because I feel like everyone tries to join that bloc, but even maybe it might be more useful to think what we could contribute to a European discussion. And I think when we look also at the Austrian debates, before I think it was Hungary that was mentioned, that is within NATO a sort of a Trojan horse. The thing is, Austria is still 90% dependent on gas from Russia. So, of course, Austrian government has no real intentions of having a real discussion based on neutrality, because if you're still very dependent and you have not done your job since 2014 in de-risking from Russia, of course, you're not honest with yourself. So I think when you're from outside Austria, you always have the impression that the discussion in Austria about the neutrality, about Russia, is not really honest. Thank you.
Thank you. I would just point out that it's nice that you said you're from South Tyrol. South Tyrol is the only part of Tyrol that is in NATO. Just to underline that point. Yes, please. I think you had a question there, gentleman.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Niki Futter. I'm a trained army officer in the 1980s, being in the Army Reserves and Militia. And I had this Cold War experience at the time. And at the time, Austria had an army of around 350,000. And we were prepared, defending like an eagle?
Hedgehog.
Defending like a hedgehog was the saying at that time. Now we have 70% of people who are against NATO, and 16%, I just looked it up, they are willing to defend their own country in arms. 16. If we would have this question in Switzerland, I guess it would be beyond 80. So how should this go together if we want to stay neutral and don't want to defend ourselves?
Thank you. Perhaps I can take one, maximum two more questions. Any questions still in the room? Yes, please, gentleman there.
Hi, my name is Nicolas Schmitzigl. One short question. Is it probably the right discussion to connect the participation in NATO with the help to defend Ukraine? Because at the moment, Austria is helping, I think, with 0.6% of GDP. The United Kingdom is only helping with around 0.5. So probably we are already helping with a lot, and we should discuss about NATO, but I think these are two separate questions.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I'll close the list of questions here, and I will now do answers in reverse order. So I would ask Mr. Schwarz to get started.
Thank you. I would like to first touch upon what Michael said about how we can engage with the Austrian public on this issue. I think it will take, let's say, a whole of society approach to tackle the issue. I think especially politics, but also the media have their role in bringing this topic into society. I don't know if anybody from the public broadcaster or ORF is here in the room, but please start becoming creative. I mean, maybe a primetime discussion format on Sunday evening, I don't know. But we do need to start discussing the topic with a broad audience. The initiative that you even mentioned in Ireland, which is a fantastic initiative, and Austria should very closely at Ireland. But I read that only 200 people followed the discussion live where it took place, and 1,300 people followed the discussion online. It shows that this is not the dimension that you need in order to have a really broad discussion on this topic. And just a quick reply to what you said. Yes, you're very right. We do need to start thinking European. I think the transatlantic relationship does have a long future because, you know, besides all the cultural ties, there is of course also strong interest from both sides in this relationship. But I think we have seen now with the war in Ukraine that strategic dependence is very dangerous. We've seen it in the energy field, but we also have it in the security and defense field, the nuclear field. We have a very strong strategic dependence on the United States, and in November we have elections in the US that again get everybody shaking in Europe. So I think, yeah, we do need to start thinking European, and Austria does have a place in that. Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Fenker.
Thank you very much. I think the first question was already answered quite well by Christoph. It's a difficult thing, Michael, you know that, right? I mean, we have not been talking so much about neutrality in the last 2 years. I mean, we had you and me, and we participated in so many debates. So it was also in media. I mean, it was in ZIP 2, you name it. I mean, it was explained, but it just takes time, and it also needs to go maybe also into education. It's a long process. It needs a whole of society approach. I absolutely agree. Thank you very much to the European strategic autonomy question. I mean, since the war against Ukraine, we did not talk, we are not really talking again in the, let's say in a sense we did before about the issue of strategic autonomy. It was huge before, but then we heard, you know, there was the time when Macron said NATO is brain dead, Trump said NATO is obsolete. That's not a long time ago, that's a couple of years ago. And Austria, Europe kind of woke up, oh, but we need to see, I mean, what about strategic autonomy? We actually need to focus on this. So I hear it from many, also from the military, Austrian military, this is the way we need to go, obviously in cooperation and also in alliance with NATO and whatever, but I think this is really something we need to do, but it takes not years, but maybe even decades until we are going to be there. So we need to face what we are facing right now, and we shall not forget what is happening in the US, obviously. Then even if it's going to be Trump, it's going to be worse, but also Kamala Harris. I mean, Joe Biden, in my opinion, was the last transatlantic president we actually had, and I don't think we're going to have that in the future any longer in this sense. The good thing for you, the good news is Austrian security strategy, even Austria decided that we need actually to get out of gas. So it was actually today, so they could finally agree. This is actually the point the government was discussing for 8 months. So because we actually finished our work in December, you and me, and so now it's, late August. So it took them 8 months to agree on that one. So there's going to be a solution. So we are working on that, but obviously, yes, in 2027. And there are a little bit some smaller opt-out things, but yes. And maybe just one thing on the willingness of defending Austria. This gives especially the military a big headache. So we have been discussing this a lot about how we actually can approach also Austrian people, tell them that what does it mean? I mean, you very often have the feeling war is so far away from us because I didn't experience it. So I'm actually the first generation I would say, who didn't experience a war or a post-war situation. And it's very difficult for us to imagine what it would actually mean being in a war and defending the country and what occupation actually means. It's difficult. I don't know how actually to resolve this, but I think I need to look it up. But if I'm not mistaken, I think that in Italy, it's the same amount more or less. So it's not that it's only neutral countries who are not willing actually to defend their country. I think there's a Gallup poll survey dealing with that. So I think that's also interesting because we say it a lot about Austria, but it's not only Austria, it's a problem which goes beyond. And then there was one. What? Sorry? Italy is not neutral, it's NATO. Exactly, but it's NATO even, but also they are not willing to defend their country by... They are covered by Article 5. Yeah, okay, we are covered by Article 42.7 in general, you know, I mean, it's, you know, it's not... Nevertheless, I mean, the mindset of the people is not so different. And
but somebody at least must be willing to defend somebody else. So, I mean, there's an issue there, of course.
I doubt that... Nevertheless, it's about the mindset. You know, I get it. I mean, we would normally also be with 42.7. It actually, the 42.7 goes beyond Article 5. But it's going to be very difficult for Austria to tell the Danish that they should actually come to help us if we say we're not going to help you. This is the thing we need to discuss. So we are not doing this. So, but I think this is the case. So how can we expect it? Yes, I think, yes, that was it from my side.
Well, I think we have from the non-Austrian speakers, we now need to get answers, in particular also to Thomas Mayer's questions. Where's the role for Europe there? Where will we stand in 20 years' time? And will Ireland, together with Austria, be the last neutral country standing?
I'm fascinated by Thomas's interview with Joschka Fischer. I had the privilege of talking with Joschka earlier this week, and it's a pity I didn't know he had given you that answer, because I would be interested to know what's wrong with being an island. The moment of truth, and you know, we're at a moment where we want Ukraine to prevail. That is, you know, to win in this war. And I think that the discussion we have about this, I think, needs to focus on what we can do rather than the things that we can't do, and doing the things that we can do better so that Ukraine can prevail. And I think there are issues that we need to address. I think we need to address the issue around refugees. I mentioned earlier the very large number that we're hosting, but there are pressures. It's the same in every country where there's large numbers of refugees and migrants, and we have to ensure that we come the right side out of that debate in our own domestic discussions. We have to ensure that Ukraine is supplied, whether that is supplied with the military equipment that it needs, or the non-military equipment that it needs, the resources that it will need for reconstruction, and for doing what it has to do to satisfy EU membership. And we have to, and I think we shouldn't lose sight of this, we have to ensure that there is popular support for that within our member states. And that is not a given. And so far, the funding, particularly through the European Peace Facility, has been off the European budget. At some point, there will be a public consciousness about what is all this costing, where is it coming from, whose budget is it going on to, and we need to be prepared for that discussion as well. And then there are issues around European security, and the one I mentioned earlier is in my own country, the maritime area. It's 10 times our land area. It is hugely significant. I'm more worried about Russia, what Russia might do in our maritime area, than I am about any prospect of Russians turning up at any one of the 800 ports and harbours that we have around our very long indented coastline. And I think we need to do some work. That's from our point of view on cooperation in that area. So I think it's really about, you know, doing the things that we can do and doing them better.
Thank you, Anna Maria.
Thank you all. Great questions. Of course, we are united in diversity. That's the greatness of the European Union, and we should respect every single member state. And there are very different ways to help Ukraine. My lessons of Sarajevo are that, yes, every war finishes with a political process. A war never finishes just with war, with weapons. But if you don't change the balance of power on the ground, they will not sit at the table and negotiate peace. So what happened with the Dayton Peace Agreement, which was, by the way, negotiated by Americans, but also by Europeans, there was one special envoy for the European Union, one for the Americans and the Russians. There was no single member state having the possibility to influence. It was a political negotiation which was made possible by the unity of the West, when the Americans and the Europeans got together, negotiating with the Russians based on a different balance of power that pushed the 3 actors to go to Dayton. So, thank you for raising the issue of the euro, because it's a response to your point. I thought I was talking about Sweden all the time, because everything I talked about was really why the Swedes changed their mind. And the summary is a sense of urgency, that Putin is an adversary that requires to be part of partnerships, alliances, solidarity, cohesion, integration, that's stronger together. So that's what brought the Swedes to change their mind. Of course, Sweden is sharing the Baltic states and Kaliningrad, where the Russians have nuclear weapons. But also political leadership, and that is a key point. You keep saying that the Austrian people are 70% against. Honestly, it doesn't impress me. The people of Sweden are 70% against the euro. I mean, I entered politics in Sweden 2003 for the referendum on the euro. Probably would not have entered, because for me as Italian, it was obvious that Sweden should be part of the euro. And again, I hadn't understood how the Swedes think. And now, 20 years later, it's been taboo after we lost it, unfortunately. And then there were all these opinion polls, the Swedes are against the euro, because no one was talking about it, no one was putting it on the agenda. It was like a state of denial. And then from last year, the past years, it started, political leadership. We put it on the agenda of this European election. Some business people started writing editorials in the, and the most politicians are saying, of course we're for the euro. Obviously, Sweden is going to enter the euro. But, it's too early. The people are not ready. Bullshit. The people will never be ready. You have to make the case, and then in a democratic way, people will make their decision in a referendum or through representative democracy. But you need political leaders putting it on the table. And that's my point about why the 70% doesn't impress me at the moment. And the last point I wanted to say to respond to your question is the dilemma between, building a very strong, also militarized, somehow foreign and security policy of Euro, with the awareness that we cannot count on our American friends. I think that has been very strong in the Swedish debate. How do we keep Americans committed to Euro? Because that's our problem, not anti-Americanism, where we know that Americans are not Democrats and Republicans, little more the Republicans, little less the Democrats, are not really enthusiastic in continuing to provide this very expensive, very demanding defensive umbrella to Europe. Well, that's why I talk so much about NATO. NATO, what does NATO mean? NATO means keep Americans engaged in Europe. That's what it means. Everything else is a lot of ideology, anti-Americanism. So we have to strengthen the European umbrella, I think, the European capacity to defend ourselves. But please, let's not dream. None of us will ever, including the Brits and the French who have nuclear weapons, be in the vicinity in the next 20 years to have the military capability that the US is deploying at the moment in Europe. So European Union strengthening its defense can only be done as a complementarity to the military umbrella that NATO is providing, mainly thanks to the US. And that was a big loss by having the Brits leaving the European Union, by the way, because at least they were a little more. So NATO, leave apart the ideology about the US because we bloody need them. EU, yes, strengthen our pillar, but no, we will never be. We are a human rights superpower, we're a civil liberties superpower, we're a trade superpower, economic superpower. I don't think we'll ever be a military superpower, and I don't think we should. So please break the ice, talk about neutrality in Austria. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. Just to add as a footnote to what you just said, that we have the European who co-negotiated Dayton sitting in the room. So I think that is also worth noting. But otherwise, I would say that it's very difficult to summarize this discussion. I mean, normally, discussions on Austrian security policy, they go the same way, and they've gone the same way for the last decades, and everybody knows every argument, and the simplest method would be to number them so that you can say, I say 17, my argument is 15, now I add 14, and it would greatly accelerate the process. So the great thing about this discussion here today is that we broke this barrier, in my opinion, and this for a long time was one of the most open and most interesting discussions I heard about Austrian security policy. And I mean, clearly the Austrians have a tendency towards introspection when they discuss this subject, and it was very good to have non-Austrian participants and witnesses in this process to get us going. And I hope that when we move on in this discussion and continue it here in Alpbach, we will be a little further and perhaps already do argument 22 when you come here the next time. I will, sorry. We will try to add some people to your 6,832 or whatever it is, and see that we increase the numbers. But first of all, I would ask you to terminate with a round of applause for this very good.